The notification chimed on Robert Harrison's phone at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a crisp October morning in downtown Chicago. He was already awake, as he had been for the past 30 years, sitting in his small apartment above his restaurant, Harrison's Bistro, with his first cup of coffee and the Chicago Tribune spread across his kitchen table. At 62, Robert maintained the disciplined routine of a man who had built something from nothing and wasn't about to let success make him soft. The message was from LuxMatch, one of those upscale dating apps his daughter Jennifer had practically forced him to join 6 months after his divorce was finalized. "Dad, you can't spend the rest of your life cooking for strangers and reading restaurant reviews," she'd said, downloading the app onto his phone with the determination of a woman who refused to let her father become a hermit. "You have a new match. Margaret Whitfield has liked your profile." Robert set down his coffee and studied the woman's photos with the same careful attention he gave to potential new menu items. Margaret appeared to be in her early 50s. Blonde hair styled in the kind of elaborate waves that suggested regular visits to expensive salons. Her photos showed her at charity galas, wine tastings, and what looked like a yacht somewhere tropical. The kind of woman who lived in Lincoln Park or the Gold Coast, who drove luxury cars and had opinions about art that she'd gleaned from museum fundraising committees. Her profile read like a social resume: philanthropist, art enthusiast, world traveler. Looking for a sophisticated gentleman who appreciates the finer things in life. No blue-collar types, please. Robert almost swiped left immediately. After 28 years of marriage to Linda, a woman who could make him laugh until his sides hurt, and who thought his best quality was his ability to fix her car's transmission, the idea of dating someone who listed sophistication as a requirement felt exhausting. But something made him pause. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the challenge implied in her dismissive tone. He owned one of Chicago's most respected restaurants, had been featured in Bon Appetit 3 times, and had built his business from a single food truck into an establishment that drew food critics from New York and Los Angeles. If that didn't qualify as sophisticated, he wasn't sure what would. Against his better judgment, Robert swiped right. The response came within minutes, which should have been his first red flag. "Robert, I'm so pleased we matched. I looked at your restaurant's website. Very impressive. I'd love to meet for dinner sometime this week. I know the perfect place." Of course she knew the perfect place. Robert typed back, "I'd be happy to meet you. How about Thursday evening? I could make us a reservation at Le Bernardin." "Oh, that's sweet, but I was thinking somewhere more exclusive. Have you heard of Alinea? I have connections there." Robert stared at the message for a moment. Alinea was one of the most expensive restaurants in Chicago, famous for molecular gastronomy and a wine list that started at $60 a glass. It was also nearly impossible to get reservations unless you booked months in advance or had serious connections. The fact that Margaret was suggesting it for a first date, casually mentioning her connections, told him exactly what kind of evening she had in mind. "That's very generous, but why don't we start with something simpler? Harrison's Bistro has a nice, quiet atmosphere for conversation. Your own restaurant? How quaint." I suppose that could work, though I was hoping for somewhere I hadn't been before. Robert felt his jaw tighten. Margaret had never been to his restaurant, despite living in Chicago and claiming to be a food enthusiast. Harrison's Bistro had been written up in Chicago Magazine as one of the city's hidden gems, and their weekend brunch had a 3-week waiting list. Either Margaret wasn't as plugged into the local food scene as she claimed, or she was the type of person who only frequented places that impressed her social circle. "How about we compromise? Gibson's on Thursday at 7. Gibson's was expensive enough to satisfy Margaret's apparent need for status, while being well known enough that Robert wouldn't have to explain why he'd chosen it. He made the reservation and spent the next 3 days trying to ignore the growing feeling that he was making a mistake. Thursday evening found Robert standing outside Gibson's bar and steakhouse in his best charcoal suit, checking his watch, and wondering why he felt more nervous than he had before his first restaurant review in the Tribune. At 62, he was distinguished-looking in the way that came from years of honest work and moderate success, silver hair that he kept neatly trimmed, laugh lines that suggested he still found joy in simple pleasures, and the confident posture of a man who knew his worth without needing to prove it to strangers. Margaret arrived 15 minutes late in a silver Mercedes that she handed off to the valet with the casual indifference of someone who'd never worried about parking fees. She was dressed in what Robert's ex-wife would have called trying too hard, a black cocktail dress that was too formal for dinner at 7 p.m., jewelry that caught the light from every angle, and perfume that announced her presence from 10 feet away. "Robert!" she called out, air-kissing his cheeks, as if they were old friends rather than strangers meeting for the first time. "I'm so sorry I'm late." "I was at a gallery opening in River North, and you know how these things run long when there are important people to network with." "No problem," Robert said, though he'd been standing outside for 20 minutes. "Shall we go in?" The hostess seated them at a corner table that Robert had specifically requested for its relative privacy and quiet atmosphere. Margaret spent the first 5 minutes surveying the restaurant with the critical eye of someone conducting an inspection rather than enjoying a meal. "It's nice," she said finally, her tone suggesting this was mild praise. "Though not quite what I was expecting. The lighting is a bit harsh, don't you think? And these chairs aren't very comfortable for a long dinner." Robert looked around the restaurant where he'd eaten dozens of times, where he'd brought his daughter for her birthday dinners and celebrated his first positive review years ago. The lighting was warm and intimate, the chairs were leather and perfectly comfortable, and the service was impeccable. Margaret's critique felt less like genuine observation and more like a need to establish herself as someone whose standards couldn't be easily satisfied. "I've always found it comfortable," Robert said mildly, "but everyone has different preferences." The waiter arrived to take their drink orders, and Margaret launched into a detailed discussion of the wine list that demonstrated both her knowledge of expensive vintages and her complete indifference to the waiter's time. She finally settled on a bottle of Caymus Cabernet that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. "I hope you don't mind that I chose something good," she said as the waiter departed. "I find that life's too short to drink mediocre wine." "Of course not," Robert said, though he'd been perfectly happy with the Malbec he'd planned to order for a third of the price. The conversation that followed felt less like a getting-to-know-you dinner and more like an interview where Robert wasn't sure if he was the candidate or the interviewer. Margaret spoke extensively about her volunteer work with various Chicago charities, though her stories focused more on the social aspects, which celebrities attended, which galas, which board members had the most influence, which events were worth attending for networking purposes, than on the actual charitable work being done. "I'm very passionate about giving back," she said, swirling her wine with practiced elegance. "Last month I helped organize a fundraiser for underprivileged children that raised over $200,000. Of course, the real triumph was getting Richard Daley to attend. Having political connections makes such a difference in this city." Robert nodded and made appropriate sounds of interest while Margaret continued her monologue. She mentioned her recent trips to Tuscany and Santorini, her new yoga instructor who trained celebrities, and her personal shopper at Nordstrom who had impeccable taste. Every story seemed designed to illustrate her wealth, her connections, or her sophisticated lifestyle. When their appetizers arrived, Margaret critiqued the presentation, the portion size, and the temperature of her lobster bisque with the authority of someone who'd never worked in food service, but had eaten at enough expensive restaurants to consider herself an expert. "It's adequate," she pronounced after a single spoonful, "though not quite up to the standard of the bisque I had at Le Bernardin last month. Have you been to Le Bernardin in New York?" "No." "Oh, you simply must go. It's transformative." Robert had been to Le Bernardin 3 times, twice for business and once for his anniversary with Linda. But something about Margaret's tone made him disinclined to share this information. Instead, he asked about her work, hoping to steer the conversation towards something more substantive than restaurant reviews and name-dropping. "Oh, I don't work in the traditional sense," Margaret said with a laugh that suggested the very idea was amusing. "My ex-husband was very successful in real estate, and the settlement allows me to focus on the things that matter to me: charity work, cultural activities, personal growth. I find that having to worry about a paycheck really limits one's ability to contribute meaningfully to society." The comment hit Robert like a small slap. He'd worked since he was 14, had built his business through 16-hour days and 7-day weeks, and took pride in creating jobs for 32 employees who depended on Harrison's Bistro for their livelihoods. The suggestion that honest work somehow limited one's contribution to society struck him as not just wrong, but offensive. "I've always found work fulfilling," he said carefully. "Building something from nothing, creating a place where people can gather and enjoy good food, supporting families through steady employment. It feels meaningful to me." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm sure what you do is very nice. But imagine what you could accomplish if you weren't tied down by the day-to-day demands of running a business. You could travel, broaden your horizons, really experience life instead of just serving food to other people." Or the conversation continued in this vein through the main course, with Margaret alternately patronizing Robert's choice to work for a living and trying to impress him with stories of her leisure-class lifestyle. She complained about her housekeeper's inability to properly arrange flowers, critiqued the wine selection at her country club, and expressed frustration that her personal trainer was raising his rates despite the fact that she'd been loyal to him for over a year. By the time dessert arrived, Robert was mentally calculating how quickly he could reasonably end the evening. Margaret had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of person he'd hoped to avoid, someone who confused wealth with worth, who treated service workers as invisible, and who seemed to believe that her comfortable lifestyle gave her the right to look down on people who actually worked for a living. The final straw came when Margaret began critiquing the restaurant's service, speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear her complaints about the water glasses not being refilled quickly enough and the waiter's failure to provide detailed descriptions of every ingredient in each dish. "Excuse me," Robert said, standing up. "I need to use the restroom." Instead of heading to the bathroom, Robert walked to the hostess station and quietly asked to speak with the manager. When David Rodriguez appeared, a young man Robert had met at several industry events, Robert quickly explained the situation. "I'm having dinner with someone who's being inappropriate toward your staff," Robert said quietly. "I'd like to pay the bill and leave, but I want to make sure your waiter gets a proper tip, despite the way he's been treated." David nodded understandingly. "Don't worry about it, Mr. Harrison. We appreciate you looking out for our team." Robert returned to the table where Margaret was photographing her dessert for what he assumed was social media documentation of her sophisticated evening out. "Margaret, I'm sorry, but I need to cut our evening short," Robert said, sitting back down. "I have an early morning tomorrow." Margaret looked up from her phone with surprise. "But we haven't even talked about our next date yet. I was thinking we could go to that new gallery opening next weekend." "It's very exclusive. You'd need to be on the list, but I can arrange that." "I don't think there's going to be a next date," Robert said as gently as he could. "I don't think we're compatible." Margaret's expression shifted from surprise to indignation. "Excuse me? I think we want different things from life. You're looking for someone to share your lifestyle, and I'm happy with mine. It's nothing personal. We're just not a good match." "You're rejecting me?" Margaret's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from neighboring tables. "Do you have any idea who I am? What kind of connections I have in this city?" Robert felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same composure that had gotten him through difficult restaurant reviews, demanding customers, and his divorce proceedings. "I'm not rejecting you as a person, Margaret. I'm simply saying that I don't think we should see each other again." "This is ridiculous," Margaret said, her voice getting louder. "I drive all the way downtown, I dress up, I agree to eat at this mediocre restaurant instead of somewhere truly special, and now you have the audacity to tell me we're incompatible." "I think it's best if we end the evening here," Robert said, signaling to their waiter. The young man approached cautiously, clearly having overheard Margaret's raised voice. "Actually, the bill has already been taken care of," the waiter said diplomatically. "You're all set." Margaret stared at Robert with naked fury. "You paid the bill without consulting me? That's incredibly presumptuous." "It seemed like the polite thing to do," Robert said, standing up. "Thank you for dinner, Margaret. I wish you well." He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Margaret sitting at the table with her mouth open in shock. Behind him, he could hear her calling his name, but he didn't turn around. Outside, he handed the valet his ticket and waited for his car, breathing deeply in the cool October air. The Honda Accord that arrived wasn't flashy, but it was paid for and reliable, much like Robert himself. As he drove home through the familiar streets of Chicago, he reflected on the evening's lessons. Jennifer had been right that he needed to start dating again, but she'd been wrong about the kind of person he should be looking for. He didn't need someone sophisticated or connected or wealthy. He needed someone kind. Behind him, Margaret Whitfield sat in Gibson's for another 10 minutes, oscillating between embarrassment and rage, before finally storming out to retrieve her Mercedes. In her mind, the evening's failure wasn't due to her own behavior or attitude. It was due to Robert's inability to recognize her worth, his lack of sophistication, his fundamental unsuitability for someone of her caliber. By the time she got home to her Lincoln Park townhouse, Margaret had convinced herself that she'd been wronged, that Robert's early departure constituted some kind of insult that couldn't go unanswered. She'd been publicly humiliated, abandoned in a restaurant, and subjected to the kind of rejection that someone of her social standing simply didn't have to tolerate. What Robert didn't know, as he fell asleep in his modest apartment above his restaurant, was that Margaret Whitfield had spent the last 5 years supplementing her divorce settlement through a series of small claims court victories and nuisance lawsuits against men who had failed to meet her expectations in one way or another. She'd successfully sued her previous personal trainer for emotional distress when he'd cancelled sessions, her former boyfriend for defamation after he'd told mutual friends about her spending habits, and even her divorce attorney for malpractice when she'd been unsatisfied with her settlement amount. Margaret had discovered that Chicago's legal system could be remarkably profitable for someone who knew how to work it, who had the time and resources to file complaints and follow through on litigation, and who wasn't burdened by excessive concern for the truth or fairness of her claims. As she lay in her king-sized bed in her expensively decorated bedroom, Margaret Whitfield was already planning Robert Harrison's punishment for the crime of failing to appreciate her. She had no idea that she was about to pick a fight with someone who had both the resources and the principles to fight back. Robert Harrison was reviewing the weekend's receipts when his phone rang the following Tuesday morning. Harrison's bistro had been busy, which always lifted his spirits. Weekend brunch crowds meant families celebrating birthdays, couples on anniversary dates, and regulars who'd been coming in for years. These were the moments that reminded him why he'd chosen hospitality as his life's work. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize with a 312 area code. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer on the fourth ring. Harrison's Bistro, Robert speaking. "Mr. Harrison, this is Margaret Whitfield. I think we need to talk." Robert felt his stomach drop. He'd hoped that Thursday's disastrous dinner would be the end of their brief acquaintance, but the formal tone in Margaret's voice suggested otherwise. "Hello, Margaret. What can I do for you?" "You can start by apologizing for your behavior last Thursday evening." Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. "What you did was completely unacceptable." Robert sat down at his desk, pulling out a notepad, a habit left over from years of taking customer complaints. "I'm not sure what you mean. I thought I handled the situation as politely as possible." "Politely?" Margaret's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You abandoned me in a restaurant, Mr. Harrison. You left me sitting alone at a table after paying the bill without my consent, which was both presumptuous and humiliating. Do you have any idea how that looked to the other diners? I explained that I didn't think we were compatible." "You embarrassed me in public," Margaret interrupted. "And then you compounded that embarrassment by treating me like some kind of charity case, paying for my meal as if I couldn't afford it myself." Robert felt his patience beginning to fray. "Margaret, I was trying to be considerate. The evening wasn't going well for either of us, and I thought it was better to end it early rather than sit through another hour of uncomfortable conversation." "Uncomfortable for you, perhaps. I was having a perfectly pleasant time until you decided to act like some kind of blue-collar barbarian who doesn't understand basic social etiquette." The insult hit its mark, and Robert felt his composure slip slightly. "I think this conversation is over." "No, Mr. Harrison, it's not." Margaret's voice turned cold. "You see, I've been thinking about Thursday night, and I've come to the conclusion that your behavior constitutes defamation of character and intentional infliction of emotional distress." Robert blinked at the phone. "Excuse me?" "By abandoning me in a public restaurant, you created a situation where other diners witnessed my humiliation. You damaged my reputation and caused me significant emotional trauma. I've barely been able to sleep since Thursday night." "Margaret, this is absurd. I ended a date early because we weren't compatible. That's not defamation or emotional distress. That's just normal human interaction." Is it normal to publicly humiliate someone who's taken time out of her busy schedule to have dinner with you? Is it normal to treat a woman like she's disposable the moment she doesn't meet your apparently very low standards?" Robert stood up and began pacing behind his desk, a habit that had developed during his divorce proceedings when conversations with lawyers had become a weekly occurrence. "I don't know what you want me to say, Margaret. I'm sorry the evening didn't go as you hoped, but I don't think I did anything wrong." "What I want," Margaret said, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone delivering an ultimatum, "is for you to publicly apologize for your behavior and compensate me for the emotional distress you've caused." "Compensate you?" Robert felt like he'd stepped into some kind of bizarre alternate reality. "You want me to pay you because I ended a bad date early? I want you to take responsibility for your actions. I've consulted with my attorney, and he agrees that you may be liable for both defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The public nature of your rejection, combined with the patronizing way you handled the bill, created a situation that any reasonable person would find humiliating." Robert stopped pacing. "You've already talked to a lawyer about this?" "I have connections throughout Chicago's legal community, Mr. Harrison. I don't make idle threats." "This isn't a threat, Margaret. This is extortion." This is a woman standing up for herself when she's been treated poorly by someone who clearly doesn't understand how to behave in civilized society. Margaret's voice rose slightly, and Robert could hear the genuine anger beneath her legal language. You think you can just treat people however you want because you own some little neighborhood restaurant? You think the rules don't apply to you? What rules? What rules say I can't end a date early if it's not going well? The rules that say you don't humiliate people in public spaces. The rules that say you don't make unilateral decisions about how to handle shared expenses. The rules that say you show basic respect for someone who's taken time out of her life to get to know you. Robert felt his anger building, but years of dealing with difficult customers had taught him the value of staying calm during unreasonable confrontations. Margaret, I think you're overreacting to what was simply an incompatible social situation. I'm not going to apologize for ending a date that wasn't working for either of us, and I'm certainly not going to pay you money for alleged emotional distress. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Robert wondered if Margaret had hung up. "Mr. Harrison," she said finally, and her voice had taken on a different quality, colder, more controlled. "I'm going to give you 1 week to reconsider your position. I think when you've had time to reflect on your behavior, you'll realize that an apology and reasonable compensation are far preferable to the alternative." "What alternative?" "A lawsuit for defamation of character and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I have witnesses who saw you abandon me at that restaurant. I have documentation of the emotional trauma I've suffered since that evening. And I have attorneys who are very good at their jobs." Robert felt his jaw clench. "Are you threatening to sue me over a bad date?" "I'm giving you the opportunity to resolve this matter privately and amicably. What you choose to do with that opportunity is entirely up to you." Margaret paused, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something that might have passed for reasonable if Robert hadn't been listening to her threats for the past 10 minutes. "I'm not an unreasonable person, Mr. Harrison. I understand that sometimes people make mistakes in social situations. All I'm asking for is acknowledgement that your behavior was inappropriate, and some gesture of good faith to demonstrate that you understand the impact of your actions." "How much money are we talking about?" Robert asked, immediately regretting the question. "For emotional distress, lost sleep, damage to my reputation, and the time I've had to spend dealing with this situation, I think $25,000 would be appropriate." Robert nearly dropped the phone. $25,000 for ending a dinner date early? For the humiliation, emotional trauma, and reputational damage you caused through your thoughtless and inappropriate behavior? Margaret, this is insane. You can't sue someone for $25,000 because they didn't want a second date. Actually, Mr. Harrison, I can. And if this goes to court, you'll find that $25,000 was quite reasonable compared to what a jury might award for documented emotional distress and defamation. Robert sat back down, his mind racing. He'd been through one lawsuit in his life, a slip-and-fall case at the restaurant that had been dismissed when security camera footage proved the customer had faked his injury. But that case had still cost him thousands in legal fees and weeks of stress. The idea of going through another lawsuit, particularly one this frivolous, made him feel sick. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "Of course. As I said, you have 1 week. After that, I'll assume you've chosen litigation over reasonable resolution. Margaret, can I ask you something?" "What? Have you done this before? Sued men you've dated?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think the specifics of my legal history are relevant to our current situation. What's relevant is that you have an opportunity to make this right, and I strongly suggest you take it." After Margaret hung up, Robert sat in his office staring at the phone, as if it might somehow explain what had just happened. In 38 years of adult life, he'd never encountered anything like this. Even during his contentious divorce, Linda had never threatened to sue him for emotional distress. They'd fought about money and custody and who got the good china, but the idea of taking each other to court over hurt feelings had never entered the discussion. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for David Chen, the attorney who'd helped him with his divorce and the slip-and-fall case. If Margaret Whitfield wanted to play legal games, she was about to discover that Robert Harrison wasn't the easy target she'd assumed he would be. But first, he needed to understand exactly what kind of person he was dealing with. Robert opened his laptop and began searching for Margaret Whitfield's name in connection with Chicago court records. What he found made his blood run cold. Margaret Whitfield had been involved in 17 different legal proceedings over the past 5 years. She'd sued 2 former boyfriends, 3 service providers, her previous divorce attorney, her former personal trainer, and what appeared to be a string of small businesses for various alleged infractions. Most of the cases had been settled out of court for amounts ranging from $5,000 to $30,000. Robert leaned back in his chair, finally understanding what he was dealing with. Margaret Whitfield wasn't just an entitled socialite who'd had her feelings hurt. She was someone who had turned litigation into a lifestyle, who had figured out how to monetize other people's desire to avoid legal hassles. She'd picked the wrong target this time. Robert Chen answered on the second ring, and his voice carried the weary familiarity of a lawyer who'd dealt with too many frivolous lawsuits. "Let me guess," David said, after Robert had explained the situation. "She's done this before. 17 times in 5 years, according to court records. Jesus. Well, the good news is that gives us a pattern to work with. The bad news is that she's probably gotten pretty good at it. What are my options? We fight it, obviously. But Robert, you need to understand that even frivolous lawsuits cost money to defend. She's betting that you'll pay her $25,000 rather than spend $50,000 on legal fees. And if I don't pay, then we go to court and prove that ending a bad date early isn't defamation or intentional infliction of emotional distress. It shouldn't be hard, but it won't be free or fun." Robert thought about his restaurant, his employees, the life he'd built through honest work and fair dealing. The idea of paying extortion to someone like Margaret Whitfield made him physically ill. "Let's fight it," he said. "Are you sure? $25,000 is a lot of money, but a protracted court case could cost more than that, not to mention the time and stress." "I'm sure," Robert said. "Someone needs to stop people like her." What Robert didn't know was that Margaret Whitfield had spent the afternoon researching his financial situation, looking at property records and business filings, calculating exactly how much she thought she could extract from him. She'd done this dance many times before, and she'd gotten very good at reading people, at understanding who would pay to make a problem go away and who might actually fight back. Margaret had misjudged Robert Harrison completely. She'd seen a 62-year-old restaurant owner and assumed he was another easy mark, someone who would pay her asking price rather than risk the expense and uncertainty of litigation. She was about to learn that some people were willing to fight for their principles, regardless of the cost. 3 weeks after Margaret's initial threat, Robert Harrison found himself sitting in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown Chicago office building, surrounded by documents that painted a disturbing picture of systematic legal abuse. David Chen sat across from him, reviewing depositions and court filings with the methodical attention of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. "This is worse than we thought," David said, sliding another stack of papers across the polished conference table. "She's not just filing frivolous lawsuits, she's running what amounts to a legal extortion racket." Robert picked up the top document, a settlement agreement dated 8 months earlier. Dr. James Mitchell, he read aloud, settled for $18,000 after Whitfield claimed he provided inadequate service as her cosmetic dermatologist. Look at the pattern, David said, highlighting sections of text with a yellow marker. Every case follows the same blueprint. She establishes a professional or personal relationship with someone who has assets, creates a situation where she can claim injury or distress, then files suit with demands that are just low enough to make settlement seem reasonable compared to the cost of fighting. Robert flipped through more files. Margaret had sued her yoga instructor for creating an unsafe environment when he'd corrected her form during class. She'd taken legal action against a high-end car dealer who'd allegedly promised her a specific delivery date for a custom Mercedes. She'd even sued her former housekeeper for breach of confidentiality after the woman had mentioned Margaret's name while looking for new employment. "How is this legal?" Robert asked, his voice tight with disgust. "Technically, it is legal. Everyone has the right to file a lawsuit, and everyone has the right to settle that lawsuit if they choose to. Margaret is just very good at making settlement seem like the reasonable choice." David pulled out a thick folder labeled Whitfield vs. Mitchell and opened it to reveal photographs, medical records, and what appeared to be a diary written in Margaret's precise handwriting. Dr. Mitchell was a cosmetic dermatologist who performed a chemical peel on Margaret last year. She claimed the procedure left her with scarring and emotional trauma, demanded $60,000 in damages. Was there actually scarring? Look at these photos. David spread out a series of images taken at various angles and lighting conditions. The alleged scarring is barely visible, and according to the medical expert we consulted, it's within normal range for that type of procedure. But Margaret documented everything, how the scarring made her feel self-conscious, how it affected her social life, how it required her to wear makeup to cover the damage. Robert studied the photographs and the accompanying documentation. Margaret had created a compelling narrative of a woman whose appearance and confidence had been damaged by medical negligence, complete with emotional diary entries and photographs that emphasized any minor imperfection. Dr. Mitchell settled for $18,000 rather than risk a trial where a jury might see those photos and diary entries and award her the full $60,000 she was demanding. Even though the scarring was minimal and probably temporary. And here's the thing, 3 weeks after the settlement, Margaret was photographed at a charity gala with no visible scarring and no makeup covering her face. She looked exactly the same as she had before the procedure. Robert felt his anger building as he realized the scope of Margaret's operation. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or social awkwardness. This was calculated fraud, designed to exploit the legal system's bias towards settlement and most people's reluctance to fight expensive battles on principle. What about her other targets? David opened another folder. Richard Santos, personal trainer. Margaret claimed he created an unsafe environment by pushing her too hard during workouts, causing her to injure her back. She had medical documentation, physical therapy records, testimonials about how the injury affected her quality of life. Let me guess, she recovered completely right after the settlement. Within 2 weeks, according to her social media posts, she was photographed hiking in Colorado and doing yoga in her backyard. No sign of any back problems. Robert shook his head in disbelief. How has no one stopped her? Because she's smart about it. She chooses targets who have something to lose, people who would rather pay $20,000 or $30,000 than risk their reputation in court. She documents everything meticulously, creates compelling narratives, and never asks for enough money to make fighting seem worth it. David pulled out the final folder, the thickest one. And this is her masterpiece, her lawsuit against her own divorce attorney, Harrison Blackwood. She sued her lawyer, claimed he provided inadequate representation during her divorce, costing her millions in additional settlement money. She had documentation showing that he'd missed certain filing deadlines, that he hadn't pursued specific assets aggressively enough, that his strategy had been flawed from the beginning. Robert opened the folder and was confronted with hundreds of pages of legal motions, email communications, and financial analyses. Margaret had constructed a case that portrayed her attorney as incompetent and herself as the victim of legal malpractice that had cost her a significant portion of her rightful divorce settlement. How much did she get? $47,000. Blackwood's malpractice insurance company settled rather than risk a trial that could have cost them hundreds of thousands if a jury decided she was right about the missed opportunities. Was she right? David's expression was grim. We contacted Blackwood's office off the record. According to him, Margaret's divorce settlement was actually larger than what she was legally entitled to, but she was convinced she deserved more. When he couldn't get her additional money, she decided to sue him for the difference. Robert stood up and walked to the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, Margaret Whitfield was probably planning her next legal assault, identifying her next target, crafting her next compelling narrative of victimization. "So, what's our strategy?" he asked. David joined him at the window. "We're going to do something Margaret isn't expecting. We're going to fight back, not just defend against her lawsuit, but go on the offense." "How?" "We're going to expose the pattern. Every target she's chosen, every settlement she's extracted, every false or exaggerated claim she's made. We're going to show the court that Margaret Whitfield isn't a victim of emotional distress. She's a predator who uses the legal system to extort money from people who want to avoid litigation." Robert felt a surge of hope for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "Can we prove that?" "We can prove it," David said, turning back to the conference table. "But it's going to require something Margaret isn't used to dealing with, a target who's willing to spend the time and money necessary to expose her completely." David opened his laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet that made Robert's eyes widen. "I've been tracking her litigation history, cross-referencing settlement amounts with court filings, documenting the timeline of her claims versus her actual behavior afterward. The pattern is unmistakable." Robert studied the data. In case after case, Margaret had claimed injuries, emotional distress, or damages that mysteriously resolved themselves immediately after settlement payments were made. The yoga instructor case was particularly egregious. Margaret had claimed severe anxiety about exercising in public spaces, then was photographed at a charity tennis tournament 3 days after receiving her settlement check. "The problem," David continued, "is that exposing this pattern is going to be expensive. We'll need to depose her previous targets, subpoena medical records, hire investigators to document her post-settlement activities. We're talking about 6 months of intensive legal work." "How much?" David's expression was apologetic. "Probably $80,000 to $100,000, maybe more if she fights us aggressively." Robert felt the weight of the number. His restaurant was profitable, but not wildly so. $100,000 represented a significant chunk of his savings, money he'd planned to use for renovations or possibly opening a second location. "There's another option," David said carefully. "We could settle with her for the $25,000 she's demanding and put this behind us. It would be cheaper than fighting, and you could get back to running your business." Robert walked back to the window, thinking about his daughter Jennifer, about the employees who depended on Harrison's Bistro for their livelihoods, about the life he'd built through honest work and fair dealing. Then he thought about Margaret Whitfield, sitting in her Lincoln Park townhouse, planning her next legal assault on someone who'd done nothing more than fail to meet her unreasonable expectations. "No," he said finally. "We fight." Robert, I have to ask, are you sure about this? Even if we win, even if we expose everything she's done, you're not going to recover your legal costs. This is going to be expensive and time-consuming, and there's always risk involved in litigation. Robert turned away from the window and looked at David with the calm determination that had gotten him through 30 years in the restaurant business. Some things are more important than money. If we don't stop her, she'll just find another target. Some other person who made the mistake of disappointing Margaret Whitfield will get that phone call, will face that choice between paying extortion or fighting an expensive legal battle. David nodded slowly. Okay, but we're going to do this right. We're not just going to defend against her claims. We're going to file a countersuit for malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Can we do that? Oh, we can do that. In fact, given her history, we might be able to seek punitive damages. If we can prove she's been systematically abusing the court system for financial gain, a judge might decide to make an example of her. Over the next 2 weeks, David's law firm began what amounted to a forensic investigation into Margaret Whitfield's life and legal history. They hired a private investigator named Maria Santos, a former Chicago police detective who specialized in fraud cases and had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Maria's first report arrived on a Thursday morning, and it painted a picture of Margaret that was even more disturbing than Robert had imagined. According to Maria's research, Margaret's pattern of litigation had begun almost immediately after her divorce was finalized 5 years earlier. Her ex-husband, prominent real estate developer Thomas Whitfield, had provided her with a settlement that should have been sufficient to maintain her lifestyle indefinitely. But Margaret had apparently decided that legal extortion was more lucrative than living within her means. "Look at this," Maria said, spreading photographs across David's conference table. "These were taken at various charity events over the past 2 years. Notice anything?" Robert studied the images. In every photograph, Margaret appeared perfectly healthy, socially confident, and physically active, directly contradicting the claims she'd made in multiple lawsuits about anxiety, depression, physical injuries, and social phobias. She claimed that Dr. Mitchell's chemical peel left her too self-conscious to attend social events, Maria continued. But here she is, at the Chicago Symphony Gala 2 weeks after filing suit, with no makeup and no visible scarring. More photographs showed Margaret hiking, playing tennis, and even doing yoga in her backyard, all activities she'd claimed were impossible due to injuries sustained through the negligence of various service providers. "The most interesting part," Maria said, "is that she's been documenting her own fraud through social media. Every time she claims an injury or emotional trauma, she posts evidence on Instagram and Facebook that contradicts her legal claims." David looked up from the photographs. "She's been posting evidence that disproves her own lawsuits. She's so confident that her targets will settle rather than fight that she hasn't bothered to maintain the fiction of her injuries after receiving payment. She thinks no one will ever look closely enough to notice the contradictions." Robert felt a cold satisfaction settling in his chest. Margaret had been so successful at intimidating her previous targets that she'd become careless, leaving a trail of evidence that would destroy her credibility in court. "There's something else," Maria said, pulling out another folder. "I've been talking to some of her previous targets, off the record. Dr. Mitchell, the personal trainer, even her former housekeeper. They all describe the same pattern. Margaret creates situations designed to generate conflict, documents everything obsessively, then leverages that documentation to extract settlements." "What kind of situations?" "With Dr. Mitchell, she specifically requested an aggressive chemical peel, signed waivers acknowledging the risks, then complained when the procedure had exactly the effects she'd been warned about. With the personal trainer, she insisted on advanced exercises, despite being advised to start slower. then claimed injury when she experienced normal muscle soreness. David was taking notes rapidly. So she's not just exploiting random accidents or misunderstandings, she's engineering situations where she can claim to be a victim. Exactly. And here's the really interesting part. Several of her targets mentioned that Margaret recorded their conversations without their knowledge. She had audio recordings of their discussions about settlements, their expressions of sympathy for her alleged injuries, their willingness to make things right even when they'd done nothing wrong. Robert felt his anger growing. She was recording people without their consent, which in Illinois is a felony if done without the consent of all parties to the conversation. But it gets worse. Maria opened her laptop and pulled up a series of email communications. Margaret has been coordinating with a network of attorneys who specialize in nuisance lawsuits. They share information about potential targets, successful strategies, and settlement ranges for different types of claims. David looked at the emails with professional fascination. This isn't just individual fraud. This is organized. It's a business model, Maria confirmed. Margaret identifies targets, creates situations where she can claim injury, documents everything meticulously, then works with attorneys who know exactly how to maximize settlement amounts while minimizing the risk of actually going to trial. Robert stood up and began pacing, a habit that had intensified since this legal nightmare began. How many people are involved in this? At least 6 attorneys that we can identify, plus Margaret herself, and possibly 2 other women who follow similar patterns. They've extracted over $2 million in settlements over the past 5 years. The scope of the operation was staggering. Margaret wasn't just an entitled socialite with a vindictive streak. She was part of a criminal enterprise that was systematically defrauding Chicago's business community. "What's our next move?" Robert asked. David closed his laptop and looked at Robert with the expression of a lawyer who'd found something he could really sink his teeth into. "We're going to do something Margaret and her associates haven't planned for. We're going to expose the entire operation, not just defend against her claims, but blow up their whole business model." "How?" "We file a RICO suit." Robert looked confused. "RICO?" Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It's federal law designed to prosecute organized criminal enterprises. If we can prove that Margaret and her attorney network have been engaged in a pattern of fraud, we can seek treble damages and attorney's fees. Maria smiled for the first time since Robert had met her. "I love RICO cases, and based on what I've found, Margaret Whitfield has handed us everything we need to destroy her." What Margaret didn't know, as she sat in her Lincoln Park townhouse preparing for what she assumed would be another easy settlement, was that Robert Harrison had just declared war on her entire operation. She'd spent 5 years perfecting a system designed to exploit people's reluctance to fight, their preference for quick resolutions over principled stands. She was about to discover that some people were willing to fight back, regardless of the cost. The Cook County Courthouse was unusually busy for a Wednesday morning in December, but Robert Harrison barely noticed the crowds as he walked through the marble corridors toward courtroom 2847. After 4 months of depositions, document production, and pre-trial motions, Margaret Whitfield's lawsuit had finally reached trial, though it looked very different from the simple defamation case she'd originally filed. David Chen walked beside him, pulling a litigation case filled with evidence that had taken months to compile. Behind them, Maria Santos carried boxes of photographs, financial records, and audio recordings that would, by the end of the day, completely destroy Margaret Whitfield's credibility and expose the criminal enterprise she'd been running for 5 years. "Remember," David said as they approached the courtroom, "Margaret's attorney is going to try to keep this focused on your dinner date and her alleged emotional distress. We're going to expand it to show the pattern of fraud she's been engaged in for years." Robert nodded, though his stomach was tight with nerves. Despite David's confidence, despite the overwhelming evidence they'd compiled, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that courtrooms were unpredictable places where justice didn't always prevail. They pushed through the heavy wooden doors into a courtroom that was more crowded than Robert had expected. In addition to the usual collection of attorneys, court reporters, and bailiffs, there were several people Robert recognized from Maria's investigation. Dr. Mitchell, the personal trainer Richard Santos, and even Margaret's former housekeeper, Elena Vasquez. Word of the case had spread through Chicago's legal community, and it appeared that several of Margaret's previous targets had come to watch her face accountability for the first time. Margaret herself sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, James Morrison, a thin man in his 50s who specialized in personal injury cases and had a reputation for aggressive settlement negotiations. Margaret was dressed in a conservative grey suit and minimal makeup, clearly trying to project the image of a woman who'd been wronged rather than the predator Robert now knew her to be. Judge Patricia Williams entered the courtroom at precisely 9 a.m., and her reputation for no-nonsense efficiency preceded her. She was known for her impatience with frivolous litigation and her willingness to sanction attorneys who wasted the court's time with baseless claims. "Good morning," Judge Williams said, settling behind the bench. "We're here for Whitfield versus Harrison, case number 2023 L4847. Counsel, please identify yourselves for the record." "James Morrison, representing the plaintiff, Margaret Whitfield, Your Honor. David Chen, representing the defendant, Robert Harrison, Your Honor. We've also filed a counterclaim for malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and violations of the Illinois Consumer Fraud Act." Judge Williams looked up from her notes. "Mr. Chen, I've reviewed your counterclaim. These are serious allegations. I trust you have evidence to support them." "Extensive evidence, Your Honor." "Very well. Mr. Morrison, you may present your opening statement." Morrison stood and walked to the jury box, where 12 Chicago residents sat ready to hear Margaret's tale of emotional distress and social humiliation. His opening was everything Robert had expected, a story of a professional woman who'd been publicly humiliated by a man who'd claimed to be interested in getting to know her, then abandoned her in a restaurant after making unilateral decisions about their shared expenses. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who'd delivered similar speeches many times before. "My client, Margaret Whitfield, is a respected member of our community, a woman who gives generously of her time and resources to various charitable organizations throughout Chicago. On the evening of October 24th, she agreed to have dinner with the defendant, Mr. Robert Harrison, expecting to enjoy pleasant conversation and perhaps begin a friendship that might develop into something more meaningful. Morrison painted a picture of Margaret as a vulnerable woman who'd put herself in a position of emotional risk only to be cruelly rejected in a public setting. He described her sleepless nights, her anxiety about appearing in social situations, her loss of confidence in her ability to form new relationships. "The defendant's actions that evening weren't just rude or thoughtless," Morrison continued. "They were calculated to cause maximum humiliation. By paying the bill without consulting my client, by leaving her sitting alone at a table while other diners watched, Mr. Harrison sent a clear message that my client was unworthy of basic courtesy and respect." Robert watched the jury's faces as Morrison spoke. Several of them looked sympathetic, and he could see how Margaret's story might resonate with people who'd experienced their own dating disappointments and social embarrassments. Morrison concluded by asking for $50,000 in damages, double Margaret's original demand, plus punitive damages to send a message that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated in civilized society. When Morrison sat down, David Chen rose for his opening statement, and Robert could see immediately that the dynamic in the courtroom was about to change. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, David began, you're about to hear evidence of one of the most sophisticated fraud schemes I've encountered in 20 years of practicing law. The plaintiff, Margaret Whitfield, isn't a victim of emotional distress. She's a predator who has spent the last 5 years systematically exploiting Chicago's legal system to extort money from innocent people. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Judge Williams gavelled for silence. Over the next 2 days, you'll hear testimony from multiple witnesses who have been targeted by Ms. Whitfield's scheme. You'll see evidence that she has filed 17 lawsuits in 5 years, collecting over $300,000 in settlements from people who chose to pay rather than fight her frivolous claims. David walked over to Margaret's table and looked directly at her. You'll learn that Ms. Whitfield recorded conversations without consent, manufactured evidence of injuries that didn't exist, and coordinated with a network of attorneys to maximize the financial damage she could inflict on her targets. Margaret's face remained impassive, but Robert could see tension in her shoulders, a subtle shift in her posture that suggested David's opening had hit its mark. Most importantly, David continued, you'll see that Ms. Whitfield chose my client as her latest target because she believed he would pay her $25,000 rather than expose her fraud in open court. She made a serious miscalculation. The first witness Morrison called was Margaret herself, and her testimony followed the script Robert had expected. She described their dinner as pleasant until Robert suddenly became rude and dismissive, claimed that his abrupt departure had caused her severe emotional distress, and insisted that she'd only sought legal remedy after he refused to acknowledge the pain his behavior had caused. Under direct examination, Margaret was composed and sympathetic, speaking in measured tones about the humiliation she'd experienced and the impact it had on her social confidence. She produced a diary documenting her sleepless nights and anxiety attacks, medical records showing treatment for stress-related symptoms, and testimonials from friends who'd witnessed her emotional distress. But David Chen's cross-examination was a masterpiece of surgical precision. Ms. Whitfield, David began, you testified that Mr. Harrison's behavior caused you severe emotional distress. Is that correct? Yes, it is. And you claim this emotional distress has affected your ability to appear in social situations. That's right. I've had difficulty attending events where I might encounter people who witnessed my humiliation that night. David walked to the evidence table and picked up a photograph. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Plaintiff's Exhibit A, a photograph taken at the Chicago Art Institute Gala on November 15th, 3 weeks after your dinner with Mr. Harrison. The photograph showed Margaret at an elegant social gathering, smiling broadly while posing with several other well-dressed guests. She looked confident, relaxed, and completely untroubled by any social anxiety. Ms. Whitfield, this is you at a social event just 3 weeks after the dinner that allegedly caused you such severe emotional distress. You appear quite comfortable in this social setting. Margaret's composure slipped slightly. I forced myself to attend that event. My therapist said it was important not to let fear control my life. I see. And forcing yourself to attend required you to smile and laugh and appear to enjoy yourself. I was putting on a brave face. David picked up another photograph. This is from December 3rd, the Chicago Symphony Benefit Dinner. Again, you appear to be enjoying yourself quite thoroughly. Damn, the cross-examination continued with a parade of photographs and social media posts that directly contradicted Margaret's claims of social anxiety and emotional withdrawal. With each piece of evidence, her story became less credible and her discomfort more obvious. But David was just getting started. Ms. Whitfield, you've filed 16 other lawsuits in the past 5 years, haven't you? Morrison jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. Ms. Whitfield's other legal matters aren't relevant to this case. Your Honor, David responded, the plaintiff's pattern of litigation is directly relevant to her credibility and to our counterclaim of malicious prosecution. Judge Williams considered for a moment. I'll allow it, but keep it focused, Mr. Chen. Ms. Whitfield, in 2019, you sued Dr. James Mitchell for alleged scarring from a cosmetic procedure, didn't you? Margaret's face had gone pale. Yes, but that's completely different, and you received an $18,000 settlement from Dr. Mitchell. Yes. Despite the fact that any scarring was minimal and temporary? That's not true. The procedure caused significant... David interrupted her by displaying a series of photographs on a large screen. These photographs were taken at various social events in the weeks following your settlement with Dr. Mitchell. Do you see any evidence of scarring that would justify $18,000 in damages? Margaret stared at the photographs, clearly realizing that her pattern of fraud was being exposed in real time. Those photos were taken with professional lighting and makeup. Actually, Ms. Whitfield, according to the metadata, several of these photos were taken with your own cell phone and posted to your Instagram account with captions about how great your skin looked after the procedure. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Margaret's attorney frantically scribbling notes. Robert could see that several jury members were looking at Margaret with expressions of dawning understanding and disgust. David's cross-examination continued for 2 hours, methodically destroying Margaret's credibility by exposing the pattern of fraudulent claims she'd made against Dr. Mitchell, Richard Santos, her housekeeper, and multiple other targets. With each revelation, it became more obvious that Margaret Whitfield wasn't a victim of emotional distress. She was a professional plaintiff who had turned litigation into a lucrative career. The trial's second day was devoted to testimony from Margaret's previous targets, and their stories painted a disturbing picture of systematic exploitation. Dr. Mitchell testified about Margaret's aggressive demands for the most invasive possible procedure, followed immediately by complaints when the procedure had exactly the effects she'd been warned about. Richard Santos described how Margaret had insisted on advanced workouts despite his recommendations for a gradual approach, then claimed injury when she experienced normal muscle fatigue. But the most damaging testimony came from Elena Vasquez, Margaret's former housekeeper, who testified about Margaret's meticulous documentation of every interaction with potential lawsuit targets. She kept files on everyone, Elena testified through a Spanish interpreter. The doctor, the trainer, men she dated, anyone who provided services. She would write down everything they said, take pictures, record conversations on her phone. She told me it was insurance, in case anyone tried to cheat her. Did she ever discuss her lawsuits with you? David asked. She called them her investments. She said Americans were too afraid of lawyers to fight, so they would pay her to go away. Elena's testimony was the final nail in Margaret's coffin. When she described finding Margaret practicing her injured back performance in front of a mirror before meeting with Richard Santos's insurance adjuster, several jury members looked physically disgusted. The trial concluded with David's presentation of financial evidence showing that Margaret had collected over $300,000 in settlements over 5 years, despite having no legitimate injuries or damages. He played audio recordings of Margaret coaching other women on how to create situations where they could claim emotional distress, and introduced emails showing her coordination with attorneys who specialized in nuisance lawsuits. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said in his closing argument, "this case isn't about a dinner date gone wrong. It's about a criminal enterprise designed to exploit the legal system for financial gain. Margaret Whitfield has spent 5 years terrorizing honest people who made the mistake of disappointing her, and she chose my client as her latest victim because she thought he would pay her rather than fight back." David gestured toward Robert, who sat calmly at the defense table. Robert Harrison could have written a check for $25,000 and avoided all of this. Instead, he chose to fight back, not just for himself, but for every person who's been victimized by Margaret Whitfield's fraud. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict that made legal history in Chicago. Not only did they reject Margaret's claims entirely, but they awarded Robert Harrison $250,000 in damages on his counterclaim, plus attorney's fees and punitive damages totaling an additional $100,000. Judge Williams looked directly at Margaret as she announced additional sanctions. "Ms. Whitfield, your pattern of litigation abuse is among the most egregious I've seen in 30 years on the bench. I'm referring your case to the Cook County State's Attorney for potential criminal prosecution, and I'm imposing a lifetime ban on your filing any lawsuit in this jurisdiction without prior court approval and posting of a significant bond." As the courtroom cleared, Robert found himself surrounded by Margaret's previous targets, thanking him for his courage in fighting back. Dr. Mitchell shook his hand warmly, and Elena Vasquez hugged him with tears in her eyes. "You did something none of us could do," Dr. Mitchell said. "You stopped her." Margaret herself sat at the plaintiff's table long after everyone else had left, staring at the jury box where 12 ordinary citizens had seen through her elaborate performance and recognized her for what she truly was. Her attorney had already begun discussing appeal options, but they both knew the evidence was overwhelming and the verdict would stand. Robert walked out of the courthouse into the cold December afternoon, feeling lighter than he had in months. The legal battle had cost him significant time and money, but it had been worth it. Margaret Whitfield's reign of legal terror was over, and Chicago's business community was a little bit safer. 6 months later, Margaret was indicted on federal charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Her network of attorneys was disbanded, and several faced disciplinary action from the Illinois State Bar. The money she'd extorted from her victims was forfeited to a victims' compensation fund. Robert Harrison returned to his restaurant, where he was greeted as a hero by employees and customers who had followed the case in local media. Harrison's Bistro became busier than ever, as people came not just for the excellent food, but to meet the man who had stood up to a legal predator and won. But the victory Robert treasured most was personal. His daughter, Jennifer, who had initially blamed herself for encouraging him to try online dating, called him the day after the verdict with pride in her voice. "Dad," she said, "I always knew you were brave, but I never knew you were this brave. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone she'd hurt and everyone she might hurt in the future." Robert looked around his restaurant, at the faces of customers enjoying their meals, at employees who depended on his business for their livelihoods, at the life he'd built through honest work and fair dealing. Margaret Whitfield had tried to destroy all of that for her own financial gain, but she'd underestimated the strength that comes from having something worth fighting for. The dating apps remained deleted from Robert's phone, but he wasn't lonely. He'd learned that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost, and that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that protected other people from predators who exploited kindness and decency for their own gain. Margaret Whitfield had thought she could intimidate Robert Harrison into paying her $25,000 to make her go away. Instead, she'd picked a fight with someone who understood that principles weren't negotiable, and that justice was worth any price. In the end, it cost her everything. Robert Harrison stood in the kitchen of Harrison's Bistro, reviewing the evening's reservations while his staff prepared for another busy Friday night. The restaurant had never been more successful. The publicity from the Whitfield trial had brought national attention to his establishment, and food critics from across the country had made pilgrimages to Chicago to sample the cooking of the man who'd taken down one of the legal system's most notorious predators. But success hadn't changed Robert's daily routine. He still arrived at 6:30 a.m., still read the Tribune with his morning coffee, still insisted on personally reviewing every dish before it left the kitchen. The only difference was that he no longer dreaded checking his phone for unexpected calls from lawyers or process servers. Margaret Whitfield was serving 18 months in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy, and her conviction had inspired new legislation in Illinois designed to prevent litigation abuse. The Whitfield Act required judges to review the litigation history of plaintiffs who filed multiple lawsuits and imposed severe penalties on attorneys who facilitated frivolous claims. Robert's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Jennifer. "Dad, are you watching Channel 7? They're doing a follow-up story on the Whitfield case." He walked to the small television in his office and found the local news segment, which featured interviews with several of Margaret's former victims. Dr. Mitchell had reopened his practice, Richard Santos had expanded his personal training business, and Elena Vasquez had started her own cleaning service with the money she'd recovered from Margaret's asset forfeiture. The reporter concluded with footage of Robert in his restaurant kitchen, explaining how one man's refusal to be intimidated had protected an entire community from legal predation. "Sometimes," Robert said to the camera, "you have to decide whether you're going to pay the price for someone else's bad behavior or make them pay the price for their own choices. I chose to make Margaret Whitfield pay for hers." As Robert turned off the television and returned to his kitchen, he reflected on the lessons of the past year. He'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do the right thing despite fear. He'd learned that justice sometimes required ordinary people to take extraordinary risks, and he'd learned that the best way to deal with bullies, whether they carried lunch money or law degrees, was to stand up and fight back. The evening rush was beginning, and Robert Harrison had a restaurant to run. But he did so with the satisfaction of knowing that his fight against Margaret Whitfield had made Chicago a little bit safer for everyone who worked hard, played fair, and deserved to be treated with basic human decency. Some victories were worth any price.